Kofi, the son of the village's most respected elder, stood on the banks of the mighty river, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. The river was as much a part of the village as the people themselves. It nourished the crops, provided fish for food, and gave life to the land. Yet, it was a force both revered and feared. The river could be gentle and life-giving, but it also had the power to unleash fury, flooding the land and destroying all in its path. The villagers offered prayers and sacrifices to keep the river's spirit calm, but they knew that the balance was fragile. The river's mood was like the wind, unpredictable and ever-changing. The elders often spoke of the river's spirit in hushed tones, reminding everyone that it was tied to the ancestors, an ancient force that could not be controlled. The spirit had been kind to those who respected it, but quick to punish those who grew greedy or careless with its power. The villagers believed that if one listened carefully, they could hear whispers from the river in the quiet of the night. Warnings, promises, and threats meant only for those wise enough to understand. The river's temper was a lesson passed down from generation to generation: respect its power or suffer the consequences. Kofi was not one to follow old beliefs. He had grown up under the shadow of his father, a man who was deeply connected to the traditions of the village. His father had always listened to the river, speaking of its sacredness and the wisdom it offered. But Kofi's heart was filled with ambition. He believed that the future of the village lay not in old ways, but in progress, in harnessing the power of the river for the good of all. He had dreams of wealth, of a new era where the river's might could be tamed and used to bring prosperity to the village. While the elders spoke of balance, Kofi spoke of control. The villagers watched with a mix of admiration and concern as Kofi set his plan into motion. He had gathered a group of the younger villagers, eager to work. They believed, as Kofi did, that by redirecting the river's flow, they could create a more stable source of water for the crops, prevent floods, and even produce electricity. The village would prosper, and Kofi would be the one to lead them into this bright new future. However, Amara, Kofi's younger sister, could not shake the unease she felt in her heart. Amara had always been different from Kofi. She was quiet, observant, and deeply connected to the traditions of the village. She had a special understanding of the river, something that no one else seemed to notice. While Kofi dreamed of progress, Amara understood the delicate balance between man and nature. She had spent hours listening to the river, speaking to it in whispers, and it had spoken back to her in ways that only she could understand. One day, Amara approached Kofi, her voice trembling with concern. "Brother, you will disturb the spirit of the river," she warned. "It will take more than you have to give." Kofi dismissed her words as superstition. "Amara, you are just like the elders. You all cling to the past. This is the future, and the future is in our hands." But Amara's words lingered in his mind, though he refused to let them shape his actions. He had made up his mind, and no one would stop him from building the dam. The villagers rallied behind him, eager for the prosperity that they believed would come. As the work on the dam continued, the river began to grow restless. The waters churned violently, fish were found dead along the banks, and strange storms seemed to appear out of nowhere, darkening the skies above the village. The elders became more worried, speaking in hushed tones about the river's growing anger. But Kofi was undeterred. He believed that the river was simply adjusting to the changes. It would soon calm down once the dam was completed. Amara, however, could feel the change in the air. She warned Kofi again, but he refused to listen. The river's spirit was no longer just a force of nature, it had become something more. The elders spoke of the consequences that would come if the river was disrespected. But Kofi, driven by ambition, ignored their pleas. Then, one fateful night, a heavy rain fell. The river rose, swelling with anger, its power unchecked. The dam, though, sturdy in design, was not strong enough to hold back the floodwaters. The river surged, breaking through the dam and flooding the village. Homes were swept away, fields were submerged, and the lives of the villagers were torn apart. The sound of rushing water drowned out all other noise as the river unleashed its fury. Kofi stood at the edge of the destruction, watching in horror as the river, once a source of life, became a force of death. He had defied the spirit, and now the spirit had claimed its price. The village was in ruin, and all the prosperity Kofi had dreamed of was gone. The elders approached Kofi, their faces filled with sorrow and regret. "You have angered the river spirit," they said, their voices heavy with the weight of their wisdom. "The balance has been broken. The river has taken what it was owed." Amara, her heart broken by what had happened, whispered to her brother, "I warned you. The river is not something to control. It is a spirit to be respected." Kofi, overwhelmed by guilt and shame, sank to his knees. The river's fury had shown him the true cost of his ambition. In his desire to change the village, he had lost sight of the balance that had kept it alive. The river had given life, but it had also taken it away, and Kofi was left to face the consequences of his mistake. The elders, knowing the village needed healing, promised to help rebuild, but they made one thing clear. The river would not forgive easily, and Kofi would have to prove that he understood the lesson it had taught him. The balance had been broken, and now it was his responsibility to restore it. Kofi stood before the gathered villagers, his voice strong and filled with hope. "The river," he said, pointing toward the flowing waters, "has held us back for too long. We fear its floods, but we do not need to. We can control it, use its power to bring us wealth and food. We can build a dam to protect our homes and harvests. A future without fear of the river's wrath." The younger villagers cheered, their eyes shining with excitement. They believed in Kofi's vision, seeing in it the promise of a better life. The old ways, the warnings of the river's spirit, seemed distant and irrelevant. Kofi's words filled them with determination. They rushed to gather materials and began building the dam, their hearts full of hope. But not everyone was pleased. The elders, gathered in the shade of the ancient baobab tree, spoke quietly among themselves. "Kofi does not understand the power of the river," one elder said, shaking his head. "He has forgotten the stories we have told for generations. The river is not to be tamed." Another elder added, "We have seen what happens when one tries to control the river. The spirit of the water will not be ignored." Their voices carried a weight of sorrow, not anger, but Kofi could not hear them. His mind was fixed on the future, a future that depended on the dam. The elders' warning seemed old and useless to him. As the dam grew larger, strange signs began to appear. The animals near the riverbank no longer roamed freely. The birds that had once filled the skies with their songs of dawn had become silent. The fish in the river began to die in strange numbers, their bodies floating lifelessly on the surface. The crops, once vibrant and full of life, began to wither under the harsh sun. The villagers could feel the change in the air, a heaviness that weighed on their hearts. But Kofi, his vision clouded by ambition, refused to see the signs. "The dam is nearly complete," he told them. "Soon, we will have all the water we need." But his sister, Amara, was not so sure. She watched the changes with growing fear. She knew the river was angry. She found Kofi one evening sitting alone staring at the dam. "Kofi," she said softly, "the river is not to be controlled. I can feel its anger. The old stories speak of those who tried to tame it. They were punished." Kofi turned to her, dismissing her words with a wave. "Amara, the river is just water. We can control it. We are stronger than it." But Amara's voice trembled as she spoke again. "It is not just water, Kofi. The river has a spirit, and it will not forgive us if we forget that." Kofi ignored her warning. He had already made up his mind. The dam would stand, and the future of the village would be secured. Then, one evening, after a heavy storm, the river's fury was unleashed. The waters, once calm and predictable, became wild and violent. The dam, under the pressure of the surging waters, began to crack. Kofi and the villagers scrambled to try and reinforce it, but the river was relentless. The sound of the water grew louder, its roar filling the night. By morning, the dam had burst. The river surged, flooding the village in a rush of water. Homes were destroyed, crops were drowned, and people screamed for help. The river swept everything in its path, showing no mercy. Kofi stood helpless as the floodwaters rose. The village that had once been full of life was now a wasteland. He had tried to control the river, and in doing so, he had destroyed everything he had hoped to protect. As the waters began to subside, the elders gathered. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with sorrow. "The river's spirit has been angered," one elder said, his voice heavy with sadness. "The balance has been broken." They spoke of the curse of the river, not just the flood, but the reminder that pride and arrogance lead to ruin. "The river is not ours to control," the elder continued. "It is a living force, a spirit that must be respected. The consequences of defying it will be felt by all." Kofi, overwhelmed with guilt, walked through the ruins of the village. The faces of the villagers, once filled with hope, now showed only fear and loss. His dream of a prosperous future had led them to ruin. He had wanted to build something great, but instead he had destroyed everything. Amara approached him, her eyes full of sorrow. "The river's curse cannot be lifted without humility," she said quietly. "Only when you understand the balance, only when you understand your place, can the spirit forgive." Kofi's heart was heavy with guilt. He had failed. He had ignored the wisdom of the elders, his sister, and the river itself. Now the village was lost, and the river raged against him. That night, as he lay awake, the sound of the river's fury echoed in his mind. The water churned and twisted, as though it was a living creature, angry and restless. Kofi could feel the river's presence, its rage pressing down on him, reminding him of his mistake. He knew that he had to make things right, but the road ahead was not clear. The only way to undo the damage, the only way to find redemption, was to seek forgiveness from the river itself. The next morning, Kofi made a decision. He would travel to the heart of the river, to the place where the water was most sacred. He had heard the elders speak of such journeys, of those who had gone in search of forgiveness and redemption. It was a dangerous path, one that few had survived. But Kofi knew it was the only way. With a heavy heart and no guarantees of success, he set out. He would face the river's spirit, and in doing so face the truth of his own soul. Only then could he hope to find redemption. Kofi stepped into the dense forest, the path before him narrow and winding. The air felt heavy, thick with the whispers of the ancient trees. Each step echoed in his chest. He was nervous, but his resolve was firm. He had to face the river spirit. He had to atone for his mistake. The sky darkened as he moved deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches like hands reaching out, as though trying to stop him. But Kofi pressed on. The ground beneath his feet became soft and damp, as though the earth itself was alive, watching him. As he neared the river's source, the waters before him began to churn. The calm flow he once knew was gone, replaced by a swirling energy. The air grew colder. His heart pounded in his chest as the river seemed to call to him. Kofi stood still, knowing that he was now at the place where the physical world and the spiritual world met. This was the beginning of his confrontation with the river spirit. The water in front of him rippled. Then, from the depths, something rose. It was not a person. It was not an animal. It was a force, a presence. It shimmered with light, but it was not bright. It was soft, like the glow of moonlight on water. The spirit's form twisted and turned, not bound by any shape or form that Kofi could understand. The spirit did not speak. It did not need to. The water itself seemed to whisper, and Kofi felt the words in his soul. He saw flashes, visions of the river's past, its power, its history, the pain and the joy of the land. The river was more than water. It was a spirit, a force of nature with its own life, its own will. Kofi's breath caught in his throat as the visions turned to destruction. He saw the flood, the one he had caused. The water rushed over the village, drowning homes and crops. He saw his people, helpless, trapped in the rising tide. The faces of the villagers, once full of hope, now filled with sorrow. He saw the elders, their eyes heavy with disappointment. He saw his father, standing among the ruins, his face full of unspoken words. And then Kofi saw his own face reflected in the river's depths. Pride, ambition, blindness. He had seen only the future he wanted, never the cost. The vision faded, leaving Kofi standing in the swirling water. The river spirit did not speak, but its presence was louder than any words. Kofi understood the message clearly. His actions had shattered the balance. The river's wrath was not just the flood, it was a punishment for his disrespect, for his pride. The spirit's presence grew more intense. The water churned, swirling faster around Kofi's feet. It demanded something from him. The river spirit's message echoed through Kofi's heart: respect, harmony, balance. These were the things the river demanded, not control. Man was not meant to tame nature. Man was meant to live with it, as part of it, respecting the ancient ways. Kofi's knees buckled as he understood the weight of the river's lesson. The curse would not be lifted by force or by trying to undo the past. It could only be lifted when he humbled himself, when he acknowledged his mistake, and when he promised to restore the balance he had broken. In the silence, Kofi knelt before the river spirit. His heart was full of guilt. He thought of his father's teachings, of the elders' warnings, and of the wisdom he had ignored. For the first time, Kofi understood the true cost of his ambition. "I have failed," Kofi whispered, his voice trembling. "I was blind. I thought I could control the river, but I was wrong. I have destroyed what I did not understand." The river spirit gazed at him, its ethereal eyes full of ancient knowledge. The river calmed for a moment, and in the stillness, Kofi saw what could be. He saw a vision of the village no longer drowned in water. The river flowed gently, its power controlled by respect, not arrogance. The crops flourished, the people thrived, and the balance was restored. The spirit showed him a path forward, a future where the people lived in harmony with the land and the river. But the vision was not just for Kofi. It was for the village, for all of them. But this future would come at a cost. Kofi understood that the price was more than the river's anger. It was humility, wisdom, and respect for the forces beyond human understanding. The river spirit spoke once more, not with words, but with a deep feeling that filled Kofi's heart. It was a choice that lay before him now. "Return," the spirit seemed to say, "and lead with the wisdom you have gained, or remain bound to the river, a guardian of its power, its spirit." Kofi stood on the edge, torn. He felt the pull of the river, a deep connection, a bond that ran deeper than blood. To stay would mean becoming one with the river, forever part of its flow. But his heart ached to return to his people, to rebuild what he had broken. The choice was clear. Kofi looked toward the village, now a distant memory of what it had been. His people needed him. He had to make things right. With a heavy heart, Kofi turned away from the river. "I will return," he said, his voice filled with newfound strength. "I will lead with humility. I will restore the balance." The river spirit watched in silence as Kofi began his journey home. The curse that had plagued the village began to lift, and the river calmed. The storm had passed. Now the real work began. Kofi knew his journey had only just begun. He had learned the greatest lesson of all, the importance of respecting the land, the elders, and the spirit of the river. His people would follow him, but they would also follow the teachings of the past. Together they would rebuild, but this time they would rebuild with wisdom. And with that, the river would no longer be a force of destruction. It would become a source of life, of harmony, once again. As Kofi walked back to the village, he felt peace within him. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew he was no longer the man he once was. The river had taught him the price of ambition and the reward of humility. Kofi walked slowly into the village, his head low and his heart heavy. The people watched from their homes, some with hope in their eyes, others with doubt. He had been gone so long and so much had changed. The river, which had once been his enemy, now seemed calm, as if forgiving him. But the scars of the past, flooded fields, broken homes, and the faces of the grieving remained. His steps were slower now, more deliberate. No longer did he walk with the proud swagger of a young man who thought he knew everything. Now his stride was measured, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Will they accept me? Kofi asked himself. He didn't know. The village was quiet, too quiet, as if waiting for something. He knelt by the river. It flowed peacefully, almost lovingly, as though it had never been angry. Kofi knew it had to be more than just water. The river was spirit, life, and history all in one. This calm was a sign of healing, a sign that perhaps he could begin again. He stood and faced the villagers. "I have returned, and with me the promise to restore what I have broken." The river now flowed gently like a mother's soothing hands. The waters that once raged with fury were now calm, almost tender, as though it too had found peace. Kofi sat by the bank, watching the ripples. It was the first time he truly understood what the elders had meant when they said, "The river gives, but it also takes." The calm water spoke to him. It reminded him of his mistake, yes, but it also reminded him of the possibility of healing. The river's peace was not only a gift, it was a lesson. Kofi sat in silence, grateful for the second chance the river had granted him. Days passed, and Kofi threw himself into work. The villagers watched him, some with skepticism, others with silent hope. This time Kofi listened. He worked with the elders, taking their advice, consulting them before every decision. He didn't rush. The work was slow, but it was steady. Each brick he laid, each field he tilled, brought the village closer to its old self. He even took part in the rituals that the elders had kept alive. Rituals to honor the river spirit, to ensure that the balance would never be broken again. The dances were hard, and the chants difficult to remember, but Kofi was determined. The first time he performed the dance to the river spirit, his hands shook. But when he finished, he felt something he had never felt before: peace. The villagers watched from afar. Slowly the distance between them and Kofi began to close. Trust was not something that could be given quickly, but it was coming back. One brick, one prayer, one offering at a time, Amara watched her brother carefully. She saw the change in him, the humility, the respect, the way he now listened to the elders. It was a change she had hoped for, but never believed would come so fully. Is he truly changed? Amara asked herself. She was proud of him, yes, but she also knew that change was not permanent. Life would test Kofi again. The river was patient, but it was also unforgiving. She prayed for him quietly, watching from the shadows. He must be wise enough to know that the road ahead is long, she whispered to herself. The elders gathered by the riverbank, their voices quiet as they performed the ancient rituals to honor the river spirit. Kofi stood with them, humbled by their wisdom. They had been the ones to guide the village when the river first began to rage. They had been the ones to help restore the balance after the flood. Now they gathered to offer their blessing to Kofi, who had changed before their eyes. One of the elders stepped forward, his face lined with years of wisdom. Kofi, you have shown us your heart. You have shown us that leadership is not about power, but about respect. You have listened, you have learned, and now you are one of us. The elder raised his hand over Kofi's head, blessing him with the power of the ancestors. May the river always guide you, and may you lead with the strength of the land, the wisdom of the elders, and the humility of a true leader. Kofi knelt, his head bowed, as the blessing washed over him like the river's cool waters. As the village began to heal, something changed in the air. The people came together, those who had lost so much, those who had struggled with grief and fear. They shared stories, celebrated their resilience, and reminded each other that they were stronger together. The people no longer looked at Kofi with suspicion. They saw him now as their leader, not because he demanded their respect, but because he earned it. His leadership came not from his strength, but from his willingness to listen, to learn, and to humble himself before the wisdom of his ancestors and the river spirit. They danced together, the sacred dance of the river, their voices rising in unison. The river had forgiven them, and now it was time to honor that gift. Kofi stood at the river's edge once more, watching the water flow. It was no longer a symbol of destruction. It was a symbol of his renewal. The river, once wild and angry, was now peaceful, its waters clear and steady. Kofi knew that this was not just the river's doing, it was his doing too. I will lead with humility, Kofi said aloud, and I will never again forget the lessons the river has taught me. The river whispered its approval, the waters gently lapping at the shore. Kofi knew that challenges would come again, but this time he was ready. He was no longer the young man who sought power, he was now the leader who sought balance. With a final glance at the river, Kofi turned and walked back to the village. His journey was just beginning, but he had learned what true leadership meant. It was not about controlling the river or the land, it was about living in harmony with them. And as long as he remembered that, the balance would remain.